Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever find yourself dreading opening a book, or even just thinking about reading? Well, today we're diving into a study that explores why that might be happening and what it means for how well we read. Imagine that feeling you get when you know you have to do something you really don't like. Maybe it is a difficult task at work, or confronting a tricky conversation. For some kids and teens, that feeling is tied directly to reading. This research looks at reading anxiety, or RA, and how it might be messing with their ability to read well. So what is the big question here? Researchers wanted to understand how common reading anxiety is in kids and teenagers, and more importantly, if it actually makes it harder for them to read words correctly. They looked at different parts of reading anxiety, like the worries you have in your head, the yucky feelings in your body, and even whether you try to get out of reading altogether. We usually think about learning to read as being all about your brain and language skills, right? But lately, scientists are realizing that our feelings, our socio-emotional functioning, play a huge role too. This study builds on that idea, suggesting that the stress and worry some people feel about reading can actually impact their reading performance. Think about it: if you are constantly worried about messing up, it is pretty hard to focus on learning new words. To figure this out, the researchers used data from two different groups. One group was younger kids, elementary school age, and the other was older kids, from early to mid-adolescence. They used a special questionnaire to ask about reading anxiety. This questionnaire looked at three main areas: cognitive symptoms like worrying a lot, physiological symptoms like getting a stomachache or sweaty palms, and behavioral avoidance, meaning trying to get out of reading. They also measured how well the kids could read words using a standard test. They actually developed their own questionnaire for this study. It had 18 items that covered those different dimensions of reading anxiety. For example, some questions asked about feeling dread when looking at long paragraphs, others about getting butterflies in your stomach during reading tests, and some about actively trying to avoid reading situations. Participants rated how often they experienced these things on a scale from never to almost always. And for the reading part, they used the test of word reading efficiency, or TOWRE-2. This test measures how quickly and accurately people can read both real words and made-up words. It gives them a score that shows how well they're doing with word reading. Now, when it comes to crunching the numbers, they used some fancy tools to see if their findings were real and not just a fluke. They used correlations to see if reading anxiety and reading performance move together. They also used something called quantile regression, which is a way to look at how a relationship changes across different levels of performance. Imagine you are looking at a whole spectrum of readers, from those who struggle the most to those who are excellent readers. Quantile regression helps them see if reading anxiety affects them all in the same way. So, what did they find? First off, reading anxiety is pretty common. A noticeable chunk of both kids and teens reported experiencing often, or always, when it came to reading-related worry and stress. This wasn't just one type of anxiety either. It spanned across the cognitive, physiological, and behavioral avoidance aspects. It seems like a lot of young people are feeling the pressure when it comes to reading. The really key finding here is the link between reading anxiety and reading performance. They found a moderate negative association. What does that mean in simple terms? It means that as reading anxiety went up, word reading performance tended to go down. This was true for both the younger children and the older adolescents. It wasn't a super strong link, but it was definitely there, suggesting that feeling anxious about reading can indeed make it harder to read words well. Interestingly, they didn't find big differences in how much reading anxiety kids and teens reported. It wasn't like one group was overwhelmingly more anxious than the other. They also didn't find significant gender differences in reading anxiety. This is important because sometimes research can show strong differences between boys and girls. Now, this next part is really crucial. They wanted to know if this negative link between reading anxiety and reading performance was stronger for kids who were already struggling readers, those at the lower end of the reading spectrum. You might expect that if you are already finding reading difficult and then you get anxious about it, the problem gets much worse. But surprisingly, that didn't seem to be the case here. The association, meaning how much anxiety impacted reading performance, was pretty similar across all levels of reading ability, from the lower performers to the average and even the higher performers. The study didn't find that reading anxiety was a bigger barrier for those who struggle the most. So, what does all of this tell us? The study really reinforces that reading anxiety is a real thing, and it is pretty widespread. It also confirms that feeling anxious about reading is linked to lower word reading performance. But the intriguing part is that this link doesn't seem to be limited to just the struggling readers. Everyone, regardless of how well they read, might be negatively affected by reading anxiety. They also pointed out that reading anxiety isn't just one simple emotion. It has these different facets: the thoughts and worries, the physical feelings, and the desire to avoid reading. And while the study found this overall connection between anxiety and reading, they also noted that these different dimensions of anxiety tend to become more interconnected as people get older, especially in adolescence. This suggests that for older kids, their worries, physical reactions, and avoidance behaviors might all be feeding into each other more strongly when it comes to reading. Remember how we talked about the association not being stronger for struggling readers? The researchers explored why this might be. They considered that maybe kids with ADHD who were included in this study might experience anxiety even if they aren't at the very bottom of the reading performance range when they adjusted their analysis to account for ADHD. The results still showed that the link between anxiety and reading performance was similar across all reading levels. This suggests that while people with reading difficulties might experience higher levels of anxiety, it doesn't necessarily mean that anxiety is a bigger obstacle for them compared to others. It's a bit of a complex picture. Now, like all good science, this study has its limitations. One big one is that they mainly looked at word reading. Reading involves so much more, like understanding what you are reading or reading comprehension. It is possible that reading anxiety might have a bigger impact on those more complex reading tasks. Also, the questionnaire they used, while developed carefully, hasn't been fully psychometrically validated yet. That is a fancy term meaning it needs more testing to make sure it is perfectly accurate and reliable. And finally, since this was a snapshot in time, a cross-sectional study, we can't say for sure how reading anxiety develops or changes over time. Longitudinal studies that follow the same people for years are needed to truly understand the long-term story. So, what is the takeaway here for all of us? This research tells us that reading anxiety is a valid and prevalent concern that can negatively impact reading performance for a wide range of individuals, not just those already struggling. It highlights the importance of addressing the emotional side of reading alongside the cognitive and linguistic aspects. For parents, educators, and even for ourselves, it's a reminder to be mindful of the emotional experience of reading. If someone expresses dread or avoidance around reading, it is worth exploring those feelings. Here is my take on this research. I think it is incredibly important because it pulls back the curtain on the emotional landscape of reading. For too long, we focused on the mechanics, but feelings are powerful drivers. The fact that reading anxiety isn't just a struggling reader problem is a game changer. It means that even people who read pretty well might be holding themselves back due to anxiety. This opens up a whole new avenue for interventions. Instead of just focusing on phonics or vocabulary, we might also need to equip people with strategies to manage their reading-related worries. However, as they noted, the study's focus on word reading is a limitation. I'd be really curious to see if reading anxiety has an even stronger effect on reading comprehension, where the demands on working memory and sustained attention are much higher, and thus more vulnerable to anxiety's disruptive influence. Also, I'm intrigued by the developmental aspect they mentioned. How do these different dimensions of anxiety coalesce and become more interconnected in adolescence? Understanding that could help us tailor support much more effectively to different age groups. Ultimately, this study serves as a crucial reminder that our emotions are intricately woven into our learning experiences. By acknowledging and addressing reading anxiety, we can potentially unlock better reading outcomes and foster a more positive relationship with books and the written word for everyone. What do you think? Have you ever experienced reading anxiety? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the amazing world of psychology. We'll see you next time.